Why do people suffer, and why is suffering permitted by children and babies, and in general, why do we suffer, is a question that has often been asked to me, and also that I have, of course, asked myself. Why would God, is the question, why would God permit suffering, for instance, by infants, which is then the assumption is that then, of course, the child is not responsible for what is occurring to them, befalling them. And I would like to humbly try to address this question, because it is a very, very fundamental question, and it goes to the mystery of the great mystery of Christ, and of what I would call the mystery of the ego. But in a very we can understand this very much in terms of, for instance, the meaning of the crucifixion, or in general what I call the different stages that the self, which is what the Christ represents, has to undergo in what we call the cycle of descent and ascent, which is what people refer to as the fall from the Garden of Eden. And what we find here is that we find the different stages of this mystery, and we find a kind of a understanding of them in terms of the why. And we find that in the crucifixion, we find that what is depicted there is the death of the ego, the willful sacrifice of the ego to connect to the higher, to the true self. And then the cross represents the opposites, which we need to contain in order to, as it were, ascend back to the true self. But the descent into the ego is actually the coming apart of the true self, wholeness, in irreconcilable opposites. And the ego really represents this the center of awareness, or of the self, when these opposites are not contained. And this is when we have the stage of the shadow, which is the side that the person rejects within, or covers up with the opposite of that shadow. Often the shadow is the repository of all the pain, which is created by the trauma or the suffering. So in that sense, do we get to the suffering? Why the suffering is necessary is because the whole or true self has to, as it were, descend and split apart in opposites, into duality. And it's there that this trauma or suffering or has to occur in order to have that discriminate, that separation, that split, which is also what causes the descent, the fall, and which at its highest point represents the complete detachment from source, which is then in that ego or that cog with that particle. And at the deepest level of that split, we find actually even a descent into hell, which is what we find also in the Bible in terms of Jesus would have been 3 days in hell after his death. So the descent into hell is even a part of this divine mystery. And the point being that we would have to come apart in order to come back together. And the reason of that is that we need to come apart in order to become self-conscious. Because only with becoming self-conscious we can be free in terms of being able to exert free will. And anything else would mean, for instance, beings in heaven in wholeness, but not out of choice or out of free will. Simply because there was no self yet when we were originally in heaven. So, to a large degree, this is why we chose, and this is the way we need to reformulate, and not that why would God permit, but why we chose to enter this cycle, to fall into these levels of real existence, and then to undergo trauma and this ripping apart of the self. And this is to a large degree we find that also does that. This is why, as it were, God, in the form of Jesus, would have himself, God's self, entered in this cycle, and as it were, demonstrated in a first-handed fashion the necessity to carry that cross, which would mean to contain these opposites, especially the part of us that is the wounded part, and then to become self-conscious and to connect back to true self and to ascend back to heaven, as it were. In that sense, God showed the way, and in that sense also, indeed, Jesus, the crucifixion was the incarnation, and the crucifixion was the way to free us. But it was not a freeing in terms of that we would be free by just accepting the example, but it would mean that we ourselves would be cast in this role of the mystery of Christ. And I have seen many dreams in which each and every one of us that undergoes this divine mystery is cast in the form of the Christ and the crucifixion and the resurrection. And in a very real sense, every process of becoming aware of the shadow and becoming aware of the true self is living the passion oneself, which we could see that Jesus was the first to illustrate to us as being the next step in the journey of the self with the capital S being what the Christ really means. So in a sense, when we take, this is where when we find the sayings as the beauty in the suffering, which is what we are doing when we look at this suffering of this man and the cross. What we are actually seeing is the divinity in this process of suffering, of carrying that burden, that cross, which is like carrying the pain, the shadow, and then ascending back to the higher levels, which is what we could say into heaven, but now self-aware. So this is where this is where we find the meaning in the trauma and in the abuse, and that there is something very divine happening, and there is in the abuse of even children we are finding, which is where we all were abused. Actually, this is where all the dreams go back to the childhood in order to find the shadow, to contain it. We were all abused there because this was actually the price to pay for freedom, and it's of extreme importance that we realize that we chose this. The right way to formulate it, to experience it, is not as something befalling us beyond our will. We chose to fall from the paradise in order to become self-aware, which is the ultimate act of freedom, because with self-awareness we find self-generation, self direction. So in a way, there is no Adam that is as it were the cause, the eternal cause of our imperfection. And there's no idea that that some serpent would have seduced us. A more mature interpretation would be that we chose to follow this serpent, which would be the entering duality or consciousness of opposites, in order to complete this, to fall and to suffer, in order to become back whole consciously. And this is why Jesus said, Jung said that all disease is an avoidance of suffering. And to a large degree, disease and suffering is basically part of this divine mystery. And when we embrace it, and when we see what it means, and when we accept that we needed to be abused as children in order to enter this divine mystery of the passion, then something radically shifts. And then this extreme painful scene to watch, for instance, in the Passion of the Christ, becomes something divine. And then we really find out again what we are looking at, because now to a large degree we are like looking at it, but we're not really conscious of what we're seeing in it. And we all, it's not only some babies and children, we all were abused. And this is why the scripture in the Bible of we need to become back like children in order to enter the kingdom actually is we need to remember when we were children to enter the kingdom. And the remembering means remembering, reconnecting to the parts of us that were, as it were, split off because of trauma. And this is not an easy thing, because it is very, very difficult to return to the crime site. But this is what the cross meant, the returning to that pain and carrying it. And so today, realizing also that abuse that created that pain, that division, the part of us that represents the traumatized aspects, that was also necessary.